Look at those wrists. Look up high on the wall if you're in an office. Check those clocks.
I don't have a watch on today, Josh.
Oh. What do we do then? We've never
I would
encountered
ask
this
somebody
problem.
what time it is. Josh, what time is it?
It's time to think.
It's a time to think.
Yeah.
Wow.
Long hand, short hand, second hand.
Second
You
hand.
got to check the second hand.
Second
too,
Hand
Chris.
Lions, a
Yeah.
movie starring Haley Joel Osment.
Oh.
Yeah.
Does she think?
What? Haley Joel Osment, the kid from Sixth Sense?
Yeah. I don't see
thinking
movies,
a different
Chris, you know
Haley.
that.
Yeah,
If you're
okay.
going to start off in the first 60 seconds with a movie reference, then you're really going to pigeonhole me for any new listeners.
Take a
as
time to think
bum.
about maybe checking out like Wikipedia and seeing what Secondhand Lions is all about. There's some foreshadowing there, Josh.
There is, yes. You have put in a little Easter egg.
And it's not about Haley Joel Osment.
I honestly, Chris, it's probably a good thing to start off with my inability on this podcast because I don't know if I can actually think today.
Okay.
Because on Friday, I was home with the kids and
You had a lobotomy.
I told I told my wife, hey, I think maybe our 3-year-old needs a little bit more energy, output.
Yeah.
It's the winter. It's harder to go outside. So she found some Tabata exercises for kids. They're cute little videos. They're like, Tabata's 8 rounds, like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off type stuff. And so they got these cartoon dragons that'll fly, and you got to do a squat to duck underneath it, right? Or
Wow.
there's one with all these different animals. You got to walk like a crab or like a
Okay.
bear, right? So it's engaging. He likes it. He was even asked to do it today. Well, it's my day off on Friday. I'm trying to spend some time with the kids, and he's like, hey, let's do this exercise. Like, all right. So I'm getting into it. My heart rate's getting up, and at one point, I'm getting a little bored because
Okay.
there was one of them was a dinosaur, and the
Okay.
dinosaur would chase you. You're supposed to run in place. Running in place 8 times in a row.
You can't get away from dinosaurs by running in place, Josh.
Yeah, I know. It's for 3-year-olds. They don't know these things.
Well, they definitely won't get away then.
So I start running around the house with the kid, right?
Okay.
And then I get bored running around the house because it's like the 3rd time we've done this video. And I think I'm going to do like a bunny hop just to kind of just really engage my calf muscles. Well, I didn't think about the ceiling levels in my basement.
Uh-oh.
And we have a nice beam
Oh, no.
that goes across part of our ceiling. So I start bunny hopping. I'm going to the other room. And then at some point I bunny hop and I hear a crack. And I feel a crack.
Uh-oh.
And I don't know if that's my head or not. And I just kind of sat down and my wife heard it and she's like really worried. And I go back and I have dented. I don't know if it's probably not steel if I dented it, but I put a little hump in this thing and I had a lump on my head for like 2 days. And I don't know if I can think today.
Okay. Well, I'll pick up the slack.
You pick up the slack,
Yeah.
and maybe you'll say, hey, you're still about the same level of thinking as you always were, which is not very good.
Well, no, it's or maybe you're that resilient, Josh, and that your level is so high above the rest of us that your thinking at a lowered capacity is actually a heightened capacity for most people.
Yeah, I doubt that's the case.
I
But
doubt that as well. I'm just trying to be complimentary. So
if anyone comes over to my house, you can come down to my basement and you can look at the
the
mark
dent.
that my large cabeza. And what I found was it's unfortunate to get a lump on your head when you're bald because there's no
show,
hiding.
doesn't it? Yeah.
So I had some people showing me the old Coneheads
Oof.
movie. Yeah, that felt
Ouch.
loving.
That is rough.
Now that we've got a movie reference out of the way that I do know, we should get to thinking. A time to think is a time, after the introduction at least, for careful, thoughtful engagement with issues in the culture and the church, birthed out of a need. We saw a need to disseminate more information than we can on a Sunday from the pulpit, and different types of information, types of thought processes that get behind and underneath cultural issues, whether those are philosophical or ethical principles, but helping people think about the things that are going on around them in the world in a relatively dispassionate, this is not a Facebook argument type of thinking. This is a let's toss around ideas and think through. So that was what this was birthed out of, and we've talked in the past few months about an issue that it's one of those things that starts in academia and it trickles down into popular culture.
Yeah.
And people probably aren't aware of the academic version of it, but they are aware of little slogans or little sayings that come out of it, right? Mm-hmm. And so anytime you hear something like, well, the Bible is translated a lot of times, or you hear something like, well, we
can't really know what's in the Bible, right?
Yeah, or haven't you heard about these other books that aren't in the Bible and they're just as trustworthy, and all these different kind of popular slogans. They get us to the academic idea, which is debating and critiquing the origin of the New Testament. So we've talked quite a bit about postmodern thought and the origins of the New Testament, and we're going to kind of move in the next few episodes to talking about specific things like the books themselves. We want to talk about the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter and some of these supposed Gospels, which we find often aren't actually Gospels at all, in the sense of how we see the narrative Gospels.
Yep.
We want to talk about those things. But first, Chris, I want to address the issue of relevance. I was talking to a brother in the church just like, hey, what are maybe the questions you have or the questions you hear from non-believers about the New Testament or about the manuscripts or about the reliability? And he just said, honestly, I find people are more disinterested than disagreeable.
Okay.
Like, he doesn't have people beating down his door saying, the New Testament's not reliable.
Sure.
He finds instead people say, that's kind of your thing, right? It's a pretty postmodern way to, you've got your thing, I've got my thing, you've got your truth, I've got my truth. But it does lead to the question, as we're spending quite a bit of time discussing why we can trust the books we have because of the New Testament's continuity with the Old Testament and the New Testament's clarity and unity in the early church and all these different things, why it actually matters apologetically to a non-believer. And so, before I give my thoughts, since I've already waxed eloquent here for a few minutes, why do these conversations matter, not just to a believer, but to someone who wants to engage with non-believers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary reason is because you're steeped in culture, right? You're always steeped in culture, and culture does involve matters of academic inquiry, whether or not people perceive those things to be academically relevant. You're going to school to become an accountant. You may not necessarily have a lot of classes where you're talking about the origins of the Bible, but you're always getting things in a particular context from individuals who are speaking from their perspective. So the other day, my eldest daughter, she is taking college classes right now, which is really strange for me.
Yeah.
It's very, very strange for me.
Cool and weird.
Yeah. I mean, she's still in high school, but she's taking college classes. And the class that she's taking right now is an English class. And her assignment was to review a TED Talk concerning happiness and to find one that addressed happiness. Now, you can go to TED Talks and find happiness coming out of people's ears.
Really?
But my
Probably
concern,
a popular,
exactly.
topic.
It's pretty popular. But my concern was that my daughter is, reviewing material that comes from some type of Christian worldview, because I know that what is informing how people are speaking about happiness is more than just happiness, right? You can't just talk about happiness divorced from a worldview, happiness divorced from a context. And so, kind of one of the dirty secrets of academia is the idea of objectivity, just like a carte blanche objectivity because you claim to be an academic. You just can't do that.
Yeah.
Right? You're always speaking from perspective. And so within our culture, when we think about these issues of, the relevance of biblical, academic discourse, right? These are things that we might talk about and kind of get excited about. But for other people, we need to understand that we're always going to be informed by people who are informed by other things. This is what's happening. And so if we do interact with people who are disinterested, disinterest is a legitimate thing. It's probably at the forefront of people's minds. But there's a reason why the disinterest is informed by ideas like if you are presented with the idea that the Bible is, and we'll just fill in with facts, then you have to be confronted with well, this is amazing, or I don't like this at all. So disinterest is something that exists, and I would say I definitely agree with this brother that more people than not are disinterested. But the way that they're getting material, the disinterested parties, the way they're getting material, what they're absorbing, what they're steeped in, is a culture that is informed by people who have formed certain opinions. That
they are not disinterested.
Right,
the
exactly.
ones that are forming, yeah. We talked a little bit about the idea. So Ehrman has accused the New Testament as being born from winners writing history.
Right.
That's a popular thing. The winners write history, right? And the implication is if the winners write history, you can't trust the history, right? And so that is Ehrman's perspective. And we talked about Kruger's response, that you can be convinced of something and accurate. at the same time. You know, you can be totally in your heart convinced that you witnessed something and not be a liar.
Right.
So these things are not mutually exclusive. But you bring up the issue of a worldview. I think that's helpful apologetically because 50 years ago, if you're trying to share the gospel and pretty much everyone agrees that there's some sort of objective morality and some sort of God who created the world and some sort of sin or guilt, and then really you just got to present Jesus. It's kind of like the book of Acts where it's like, all right, cool. They already believe in the Messiah. They already believe in a necessity for atonement, and you just got to say,
and
he's the risen one, right? And so early in the book of Acts, before the gospel starts to spread to the Gentiles, the sermons are pretty simple.
Right.
Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is risen Lord. Because all you had to do is fill in one piece.
Yep.
Now, we can make the mistake in modern apologetics to think that's all we got to do.
Right.
We just got to convince someone of guilt, or just got to convince someone
asking
that
somebody
Jesus...
a question like, would you like to be saved? That's actually a pet peeve of mine when I hear that, because it's like, to this culture, what does that even mean?
Right.
Right.
And so sometimes as you're addressing small pieces of the conversation, like sexuality. I was talking to someone in the church, and they're like, I'm evangelizing to someone who identifies as this and that sexuality-wise. And I was like, well, so address that as a local issue, as a narrow issue, but then make sure you expand out to say, here's actually the broad sweep of Scripture.
Yep.
Because they have a worldview, like the modern worldview, something like this. We are here by chance through material processes. Yeah. And therefore, there is no external demand on me to use what I have in any certain type of way. Yeah. There was no design for my body.
There's no meta-narrative.
I'm not fitting into a story, and I'm not aiming toward a destiny. And so meaning and purpose are things that are self-defined. Yeah. So when you come to someone talking about how they use their body, well, all of their worldview points to they decide.
Yes.
So you then have to be able to scale back and say, what if there's a different way to view the world? Mm-hmm. What if instead your body is designed? And actually the meticulous way it functions together is proof of design. And what if, because it's designed, the person who designs it can impose upon you demands for how you use the design? Or not even just that, because maybe that feels oppressive and restrictive, is there's a goal for your body. There's something you're moving towards. And yet, the problems you experience with disorientation are not because of the design, but because of an alien, because of a parasitic issue called sin. Yeah. And so your body, one of the reasons you love it is because it was created good. And one of the reasons it causes frustration is because sin has marred it. Yep. And there's a Redeemer who has a resurrected body. And he's bringing us toward a world with resurrected bodies. Yep. That's a very different meta-narrative, a very different worldview than I'm here through materialistic processes. So one of these things is like someone might be disinterested, but if you can say like, okay, you're uninterested by the Scriptures, how do you view the world? Now you can maybe get them to be interested. Yeah. And one way I think maybe we can, as long as we do it graciously, we can maybe provoke interest or poke someone to interest is to appeal to the desire for rationality. Okay, most people around us want to be rational.
Yeah, and irrational is a negative connotation, right?
Yeah, so most people who disbelieve the Scriptures probably do it because in their minds it is irrational to believe. It's irrational to believe that God, it's more rational to believe in the Big Bang Theory than it is for an intelligent designer. It's irrational to believe that God speaks. It's irrational to believe that humans could write Scripture and it would be perfect. I mean, humans are imperfect. That's irrational. Supernatural miracles are irrational. Right. So you just kind of stack up the irrational. Well, what if you're talking to this disinterested brother or sister and you're just saying, well, you don't want to be irrational, right? It's like, no, that's the worst thing. Right. Well, what if your worldview is actually more irrational than mine? Would you hear? Just give me a shot to prove that maybe I'm more rational than
and how irrational.
Because you
really
wouldn't want to be irrational, right? Right. And like I said, there's a deftness you got to do there. But if with certain people, you could appeal to like the desire to not be irrational with saying, what if there was a better viewpoint that you didn't know about and you would be embarrassed to not, so any thoughts on that idea of kind of trying to provoke interest with a loving plea toward rationality?
Yeah, I think any presentation of the gospel has to provoke interest on one level because we live in a problem-filled world. right? So we live in a sin-soaked world. It's fallen, lost and ruined by the fall, as it were. Humanity has been, as the hymn writer.
We were at a conference, and there's just a really good pastor that we enjoy. His name is Jonathan Parnell, and it said his name, the title of his talk.
Which was Lost and Ruined by the Fall.
So
we felt very bad for Jonathan.
The title was Jonathan Parnell, Lost and Ruined by the Fall. And we were like, ain't we all, brother?
This is a tough message.
But apparently you in particular.
Yes. So, I think because we live in a world that is soaked with sin, anytime we're interacting with people, like there is a certain, and, I appreciate, the idea of deftness with how you interact with people, because it is easy to become a manipulative individual, right? The whole idea of 19th century Finneyism, revivalism, of preying on people's emotions, preying on people's fears in a way that is unhelpful in order to present something, in order to get a response. It's not what we're looking for. But what we do want to, represent to people is that if you are experiencing some type of, we'll just call a fallenness dysphoria. The term dysphoria is something that people use a lot these days. And, the idea of dysphoria is that there's something wrong,
right?
And so if it's gender dysphoria, there's something wrong with me. It's like, well, let's use that term then. And let's discuss, what is dysphoric about the world that we live in? And the reality is we take a broader perspective than just in a local isolated thing like gender identity, and think is this world, does it really make sense? Does this world really actually present to us a satisfying environment with which to pursue hopes and dreams? And the answer is no, it really doesn't, because this world is filled with carnage, and it's the carnage of sin. That's where we go to the helpful way to present the gospel is always going to involve the first line item, which is God created this world for his glory. And the second line item is we rejected that, right? And so that's where everything, all the chaos that people perceive, the dysphoria that people perceive, stems from. So anytime we engage with somebody in presentation of the gospel, there has to be some touch point, because we are living in a fallen world, and Jesus came to restore. He came to redeem. He didn't just come to offer forgiveness as though that's the only issue. And like you said before, the culture that we lived in, for, probably 150, 200 years, at least in, Western, Anglo-American culture, there were many assumptions that just factored into daily life and religious life. The biggest problem that people had presented to them was, how do you deal with the guilt of your sin? How do you deal with the consequences of your sin, which obviously is a major problem. But because we've drifted in our culture, those assumptions are not there. They're not built into things. And so we have to help people understand that the issues that do matter to them, and I don't mean hey, here's how you fix your budget. I mean somebody feels like there's something very wrong, very warped, and they can't put their thumb on it. We have to be able to help people identify that this is a problem because of sin.
Yeah, and so that would bring us to the next point, which is no one can stay disinterested.
Correct.
You just can't, either you are 8 and you don't care now, but you're going to really care when you're 14. You're going to go through this adolescent decade, and whether it's 14 or 18 or 22, there's a reason evagelism happens on college campuses and can be pretty successful. It's because people are wrestling with these questions in young adulthood.
The Derek Zoolander question, who am I?
Yeah. Right? Oh man, Derek Zoolander. So there are periods in time, whether it's adolescence or midlife or end of life, there are always periods of time that are going to spur disinterest. And one of the reasons we want to heavily understand why we believe what we believe is because people are gonna hit those moments, and we got to be ready if they come to us. And I think one of the things that apologetics does, the defense of the faith, is it helps people to see that Christianity is the most rational way. Because a lot of times people are going to start to say oh, maybe there's something more out there, maybe I need more, but that's irrational. And apologetics helps you see no, actually this is the most rational thing, which starts to eliminate these barriers where people actually have to just come to face with who God is and whether or not they believe, rather than, well, I kind of am interested in this Christianity thing, but I don't think you can trust the scriptures because they've been translated so many times. There are these little lingering thoughts that can keep us from changing a worldview, and apologetics helps just deal with those lingering thoughts. Now, a case study in this is recently the Wikipedia founder, I guess the guy founded it in the early 2000s. His name is Mark Sanger, I believe. He wrote a long essay, and the Gospel Coalition did kind of a summary on it about coming to Christ. And it sounds like, he said, if you knew me years ago or before 2020. And so it sounds like, this article written in 2025 was 5 years in the making, which number one is really respectable because it sounds like he took his time, came to Christ, and waited to disseminate the information. Not like a lot of these popular examples like a Kanye West or a Russell Brand who have a religious, or Shia LaBeouf have a religious experience, and all of a sudden they're going on podcasts and going on talk shows and sharing. It's like a danger for, 1 Timothy, let the elder not be a recent convert. Right? So it's popular these days for a celebrity to encounter some religious experience and all of a sudden become a teacher. It's like, whoa, you need to be able to rightly handle the word of truth. But with Sanger, it sounds like something happened around 2020 and he started wrestling. Now, here's where this comes in line with the idea of relevance and rationality and our discussion of canon. Sanger had questions that people didn't answer for him. He shares particularly of an experience in his kind of adolescent stage, 14 to 18, where he started to come around New Age spirituality, mystic beliefs.
And he's a Gen Xer. He's a guy in his mid-50s.
Yes, yeah. And so his dad was kind of leaving the faith. He was from a Lutheran background, and he's encountering different philosophy ideas, different New Age beliefs. And he says he goes to a pastor. And he says it was an admittedly bold thing to do because I had questions that I wanted answers to, but he does say I wasn't being rebellious. I wasn't trying to go stick it to the pastor. I really needed help. And he said what he experienced was someone who seemed frustrated with and shrugged off his skeptical questions. And so you've got this 17-year-old going to someone who should have answers to his skepticism and his questions, needing help, and he doesn't provide answers. Well, that leads to him pursuing a PhD in philosophy. He's an atheist, and he described himself as a rationalistic and skeptic for 30, 40 years until something else happened and his indifference was changed again, and he started wrestling with these questions, and he found answers, and they were intellectually satisfying. And he realized that these weren't irrational beliefs. Now, why do we share that story? It's not just because pastors need to be ready, but all Christians need to be ready for their friends to say, I'm feeling this disorientation or this dysphoria in this world. And you're telling me you're a Christian, but it seems irrational. I've got all these questions. And we have to be able to provide answers to their questions so that we can help them see that Christianity is rational not just because we need to appeal to the modern mind, but because God's ordered creation is ordered by rationality and logic himself. Right? Thoughts on that idea of needing to be prepared for these people in moments where indifference goes by the wayside and they have questions?
Yeah, it's I really don't in any capacity desire to communicate that there's more value in this gentleman than a guy you just see walking down the street. But here's the thing, like the influence that he has had on pop culture, going back to, I think of a Michael Scott quote, which, I'm wont to do, where he's like, Wikipedia is the best because literally anybody can, edit it. So it's the best of all possible information on Wikipedia, right? So, Wikipedia has a place in our culture that's significant. I know for my part, if I ever look for like information about an individual and I'm like, when was this person born? What's their background? Whatever.
Sometimes it's the only place you can find someone's age.
Sure. Yeah. You just go to Wikipedia and find it and whatever. So, the fact of the matter is he has influenced our culture significantly. Now, when he's an adolescent, you said he grew up in Alaska. If you're an individual who's in a ministry position or, an individual in a church and you have somebody come up to you and ask a question, the person you're speaking with, I'm reminded what C.S. Lewis said. He said, like, you're never talking to a mere mortal.
Right.
So everybody you speak to has a certain dignity and value and worth and significance that may go well beyond the immediacy of the particular situation you're in. And it may indeed turn into a circumstantially significant thing as well, right? An individual you speak to that, even I'm just kind of wandering right now, but this is how my brain is working right today is, SNL had this over the weekend, a concert, and celebrated 50 years of musical guests. And they had surviving members of Nirvana, and then Post Malone step in for Kurt Cobain. And as I was watching this, and I feel like it was, you can't substitute Kurt Cobain.
Sure.
You just can't do that. But, I know from reading on Wikipedia, part of Kurt Cobain's history was, as a teenager, he had a broken home situation, and he went and stayed with a Christian family. And I'm like, obviously the Lord in his providence works as he does, but you're thinking, man, what possibilities of interaction do I have with people that if I simply, and Kurt Cobain wrote a lot about religious issues in, Nirvana lyrics and everything. And you're just thinking, man, what would it have been like to be an individual who is influencing somebody for Christ because they're willing to take seriously the questions that an individual in a fallen world is presenting them.
Yeah.
And that's, that's honestly one of the reasons why we do what we do here, is because we can't answer everything from up front. From a pulpit, our responsibility is to preach the text, and as things show up, things show up.
Yeah, you don't want to quote Derek Zoolander and Michael Scott and Nirvana back to back to back in a sermon,
Not typically. But
I'm just picking.
What you do want to do though is you want to present people the opportunity to recognize that you are speaking from a position as a pastor. You're handling God's word in a way that everybody needs to hear it, and also accessible to individuals. And this is one reason why, mega church ministry has such a difficulty attached to it, because who actually gets their questions answered? Mm-hmm. Are we depending on people going to ask their questions of people they don't know? Is that what we're doing? And, in this particular situation, somebody did know this gentleman, mm-hmm. and responded with an indifference that is reflective of somebody who couldn't have cared less even if he didn't know him, right?
Yeah, as we're discussing the issue of relevance and kind of rationality, it's made me think more of doing kind of like a series focus on apologetics questions in the near future, just kind of bouncing off this, because really the canon question is a deep dive into something that I think is meant to do two things: give confidence for believers, right? Believing that we have the words of the apostles doesn't make you a Christian.
Right.
But as a Christian, it gives you confidence when you read the words of the apostles, right? So you're like, okay, I believe in Christ because I've witnessed something about him, that he is the risen Lord, and I found it through the word, and now I'm building greater confidence in the word.
There's good reason to believe it. Yeah.
I found Christ. And so for the believer, really, these conversations are confidence-inducing, right? Yep. You remember, oh yeah, I'm not a fool. Like, this makes more sense, right? And then for the non-believer, it's the Christian being ready, just in case someone says that their barrier to belief is this. But there are there's the problem of evil question. There's the design question. I think we could spend a couple weeks talking about just some basic apologetics things. But to wrap up, just for this first introduction piece is, people may seem indifferent, and they may not even knock on our doors answering questions, but we do have a responsibility as Christians to both be witnessing to our faith and to be inviting those types of things, and to invite conversations, to be ready. And one of the ways we are ready is through thinking through these issues. So the reason, Chris, I wanted to use that as a springboard is because a lot of Kruger's next chapter on the New Testament just has to do, I think, with logic.
Sure.
And so we're going like, within the system of Christianity, it makes a lot of sense that we have a New Testament. That's basically the thrust of his chapter, because he quotes a lot of liberal scholars that say the New Testament documents weren't necessary or weren't... I'm testing myself, Chris. I flamboyantly, maybe flamboyantly is not the word. I with a lot of flair threw my book over the chairs earlier.
I did see you do that,
because I didn't want to rely on my notes, and now I'm like, I wish I had the quote in front of me. Basically, a lot of scholars, Kruger quotes that say the New Testament wasn't a necessary entailment of Christianity. So people that are saying, hey, we have to have these words, we have to trust these words, a lot of liberal scholars are saying, no, you don't. Like, it was oral tradition, not written tradition, is one of the common things. So we don't, just saying you have written words doesn't mean anything, because oral tradition was more...
Maybe we should depublish all of their books and have them rely on oral tradition.
Funny. And so Kruger responds by saying, hey, there's 3 reasons why it's really logical that we have a New Testament. Number 1 is the issue of covenant. Number 2 is the issue of, or the pattern of redemption and revelation. Mm-hmm. And number 3 is the idea of a community that's formed by a canon. Number 1 is the issue of covenant. And Kruger shows something that, having been at RTS, you've probably heard 6 dozen times, because Presbyterians love covenants.
It's true.
And there's the idea that when the Old Testament was written, there was something called a suzerainty treaty, and it had a pattern, and covenants that God gives were based on that pattern. And so God is essentially revealing himself in a way that was familiar to the culture, right? I like to just put you on the spot. What were some of those components of the suzerainty treaty?
So there were stipulations,
right?
There was the declaration of, effectively ownership. So you have the king and the vassal, the 2 different parties involved. So the king, the ruler, would conquer an area typically. And then you would have the vassals, those that are under the, depending on the benevolence of that particular king, either the rule or the protection of that king. And so you'd have a declaration of who this king was, and a declaration of his potentially history or his character. You'd have stipulations of the covenant. These are the things that you are responsible to do. These are obligations you have. And then you have blessings and curses.
Right.
So if you keep the words of that covenant, these are the good things that will happen. And if you break the words of the covenant, here's how you will be strung up on a tree somewhere. I mean, that's just so in ancient Near Eastern suzerainty treaties, that's how it worked. And when we see those patterns develop in Scripture, what we're seeing is God making declarations and making stipulations as far as, if you are my people, this is how you will live. And if you are not my people, you will also be living, in this different way. So, yeah. So you nailed it. Historical prologue, some sort of preamble, which is the story. I always think about Schoolhouse Rock when I think of preamble. Sure.
So historical prologue, preamble, stipulations, blessings, and curses. Think about Exodus 19, where the Lord, having just taken Israel out of Egypt, says, historical prologue, introduction, I'm the God who took you out of Egypt. Blessings, and I'm going to make you a treasured possession, right? You will be treasured amongst all peoples. Stipulations, I'm giving you tablets. I'm going to give you some commandments. I'm going to give you a tabernacle. Tabernacle? Wow,
awesome.
That's the whole getting my head hit on the basement ceiling coming out. There's one more component, and I just hinted at it, one more component to the treaty that we probably just think, well, no duh. But how do we know about the covenant?
It's written down.
There's documents, right?
Yes.
And so I don't know if you've heard this before, but Kruger makes the argument that, you got the children's pictures with the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments.
Sure.
And the 2 tablets imply that like God could only fit 5 on one and 5 on the other. It's like he just wrote too big.
Ran out of space.
You know how you make posters, and you start off and you're like, this is going to be a great poster, and oh no, I'm out of space.
Yep.
And so God needed 2 tablets. But rather what happened was that you have a tablet for the king and a tablet for the people, right? You have a document for the king and a document for the people so that they know what the covenant is. And Kruger points out that the very nature of how God related to his people in the Old Testament by way of covenant and documentation is the exact same nature how he's relating to his people in the New Testament.
He actually commanded his people to have his word between their eyes, right in front of them all the time.
Right. And so there's a logical consistency to say that the God who reveals himself through a covenant that has documentation then promises a new covenant in Jeremiah, right? Kruger says the Jews would have expected documentation of the new covenant. And then Jesus comes and says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. And after establishing the new covenant, he tells the disciples, go teach everyone to obey all that I've commanded you. He wants them to put before the eyes of everyone else all his commandments. Well, what's most logical in this system? Documentation.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'd mentioned the other week watching these Jewish evangelists, these men who are Christian people from an ethnically Jewish background in Israel, and going sharing the gospel with people. And I believe, if I'm hearing them correctly, and I think I'm hearing them correctly, is they're speaking in Hebrew to people on the streets of Israel throughout the nation. They refer, so the Old Testament is the Tanakh, but then as you talk about the New Testament, they call the Barit. something or other. Now,
Interesting.
what we know from Hebrew is barit is the word for what?
Covenant.
Covenant. So,
Wow.
even to, 21st century Jew, the word barit is associated with the New Testament or the New Covenant.
Yeah, and if there was a new covenant, there's a new order of relating to God.
Yeah.
You might want to know who God is, what he's done, what he requires of you,
Yep.
what he will give to you, or what will be done if you don't.
Right.
Those would be all of the historical prologue, preamble, stipulations, blessings, and curses.
Yep.
And if you would want to know that, if hypothetically God has revealed a new way of relating to people, you'd want to be able to have some documentation to understand that. And so this is just the point that the idea of written documentation of the covenant is logically consistent with how God has revealed himself both in the Old and the New Testament. The next idea that Kruger puts out is the redemption revelation pattern. Think similarly about Exodus. God redeems people and then reveals. And he makes the point that revelation follows redemption to kind of explain the redemption. So just another point that the New Testament, having documents that come after Jesus's dramatic defeat of death on the cross and redemption of people, Jesus is discussed as leading a new Exodus.
Yeah.
And have you seen this before? I just noticed for the first time in Jude that Jude says Jesus led people out of Egypt.
Yep.
So interesting, right?
Jesus who led a people, right.
Right. And so Jesus is being equated with God who redeemed, right? So when God redeems, he reveals himself.
Yep.
Now, someone might say, so what to that? But I think there's a point to stop and say, how do Christians engage with people who don't believe God reveals himself? Because for us, we're like, okay, God is a God who speaks. And he speaks about himself. He speaks about what he's done. He speaks about what he will do. How do we take this and say, okay, it's logically consistent that God redeems and then reveals, and therefore we have a New Testament? And how do we talk to someone who doesn't think it's logical that God reveals? Is there a logic inherent to God that he would reveal himself?
Yeah. I mean, and that's, so, there's all kinds of, apologetics is just kind of a strange category because I think classically speaking apologetics, so classical apologetics is a school, and it's a school of thought that I would say in many respects.
Is it a school for ants?
A school. What is this?
Oh, I'm just trying to get down to your level.
Thank you. If the kids are going to learn how to read good, they need to be able to fit in the building, Josh.
Yeah, dude.
That's what needs to happen.
I agree.
So, I would say that the school of classical apologetics is somewhat deficient for the culture we live in right now, because in the classical apologetics, many assumptions are made about the place people are coming from, right? And so people are going to be coming from a particular background of, a Christianized worldview, that the assumption is not that there are many gods, or the assumption is that there is one God if there is a God, right? And so the task of a classical apologist is to come at an individual and say, here, let me convince you of why these facts are true, why these facts are, this, that, whatever. When it comes to the world in which we live right now, people don't operate that way. And so I think classical apologetics has a place, to be sure. But what we need to do when we engage with people, when we engage with non-Christian people, is to understand that there are basics of human experience that can always be leveraged, right? So we talked before about kind of finding that particular spot where somebody is catching in the fallenness of this world. And it's just like, oh man, I feel the fallenness of this world in this way. Right. And so if somebody feeling a particular degree of dysphoria over the world they live in, it's like, all right, well, let's talk about why that is. OK, when it comes to addressing this issue of is it logical, is it rational for, a God to speak? Right. So think, well, if we look at the meta narrative, and we're going to be going through Genesis in a handful of months as a church, we're going to be going through that wonderful book. And we see right away showing up that God is plurality, right? So we have, even in the Shema, right? It's like the one Hebrew thing I remember, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The word
You
Echad.
remembered Berit too.
I did remember.
That's two
I remember a few things, but anyways, so Echad, the word for one, is it does not necessarily mean a singularity. It can involve a unity and diversity. It can involve a plurality. And so right away in Genesis chapter 1, we see God speaking of himself as a God who is in community. There is a God who is one. And yet also, strangely, in the first couple chapters of Scripture, we find God introducing himself as the one who is also a community. And basic to humanity is the idea of communication, the idea of personal communication, right? We don't communicate to the abstract. We don't speak to gravity and say, gravity, I will declare to you today how I feel. We don't tell gravity when we're being, when we fall down, like, gravity, I wish you would not do this, right? But when people are crying out to whatever God they're crying out to, they're expecting a personal response, and they're expressing a personal desire. And so, just built into that fact, it's funny. We have a culture that.
I mean, you're thinking Gary Sinise on a boat.
Yes, Lieutenant Dan. Yes, raging at the storm.
He's talking, right? He's using form of communication to try to get someone's
choice
attention.
Words. Yeah, using choice words. But it's interesting because we have a fascination in 21st century Western culture with ancient Eastern culture, and if people only understood what ancient Eastern culture, dealt with or deals with in its worldview of personality, right? So Buddhism and Hinduism are, historically related, ancient relationship, but they have wildly divergent views of personality and deity. Buddhism doesn't even believe in a personal deity at all, right? And so it's like, okay, if you are interested in becoming a Buddhist, are you interested in the idea of nothing? Because that's what Buddhism teaches, right? The ascendancy to nothingness. Meanwhile, you have a Hindu who, within Hinduism makes allowances for a multiplicity of gods, none of which you can have any assurance is actually personally related to you in any capacity, right? So you think, okay, well, the Christian God is a God who is one God in community in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and he is intensely interested as the one God who is ruling over everything with people. I mean, it's a strange thought. But the non-God of Buddhism doesn't care because there is no God in Buddhism, and the multiplicity of gods in Hinduism doesn't care because you have a whole multiplicity that care more about their bizarre behaviors toward one another. But the God of the Bible is a God who cares enough about humanity to create it, and then cares enough about humanity to speak to it.
So it sounds like there's a way in which you can indirectly communicate this, not by laying out this is why you should believe God speaks, but by pulling back to the meta-narrative and showing people why God speaking within the Christian story makes sense.
Yep.
And then that's a bit of an indirect thing where you're able to, can I show you what this story entails?
Yep.
And it's a true story. Saying story does not mean myth,
right.
But the scriptures are a story. Yep. That's that redemption revelation piece.
Yep.
God does something in history and then explains it, right? One way to get at this, and this is where John Frame hangs his big hat on, is to say that the God of the Scriptures, he says a lot, like people will say, well, I don't have time to investigate all religions.
Sure.
And so I can't just investigate Christianity if I'm not going to investigate Buddhism, Islam, all these different things. And it's basically a defense tactic, like I'm not going to investigate any religions.
So leave me alone, right?
And so what Frame says is in that environment, you should say, well, let me show you why Christianity is distinct among all religions.
Right.
Therefore, you should study it. And I can give you some markers that everyone else shares. Mm-hmm. And what he does is he says Christianity is the only religion that presents an absolute personality.
Yep.
And so, maybe there's got to be one more distinctive there because Allah would be an absolute personality. No, because he needs the creation, right? So I'm kind of working this out as we're talking, but so a plurality of gods does not present an absolute person. It presents many people. None of them are absolute.
Right.
None of them are supreme. None of them are in charge. A pantheistic or atheistic worldview does not present personality at all.
Yep.
But let's say this. The Abrahamic religions, let's start there.
Sure.
The Abrahamic religions, because Islam is really a heresy off the Abrahamic religion.
Right.
The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, present absolute personality. Here's why this matters with the canon discussion, is Frame wants us to ask people, does it make more sense that the impersonal, say the Big Bang Theory or evolution or materialistic naturalism or whatever the origin story is that is impersonal, led to the personal that we see today.
Right.
I mean, things like love, things like community commitment, all of the different emotional, relational pieces we see within humanity. Does it make more sense that the impersonal led to the personal, or that the personal led to the personal?
Right.
Well, if it makes more sense that the personal led to the personal, then we talk about the only religion that has absolute personality. And when we get there, so this is still setting up the ball on the tee, we can say, is it more logical that the absolute person who created everything we know and everything we see that's personal decided to not tell us about himself?
Right.
Or decided to tell us about himself? Well, it seems more rational that if there's a personal God that created all the personal things we see, he'd want to be personal, right? He'd want to tell us, he'd introduce himself. So that would be maybe a way to get at the logic of God's revelation to a culture that doesn't believe in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll talk more about frame because I do think I want to do this apologetics series just because some of our series in the past that have been most appreciated, or at least numerically most appreciated, have been some of the things like the discipleship series that had a little bit more how-tos or practical things. But there's a little foray into the apologetics world on this episode. Next episode, I'm excited, Chris, because we're finally getting to do what I've wanted to do this whole time, which is talk about the Gospel of Thomas.
Because of your son.
Yes, because my son wrote it. Because it's,
He might as well have.
Might as well have. Because the Gospel of Thomas represents really the poster child of modern liberal scholarship that tries to say, look, there were other documents.
Right, exactly.
And so we want to now engage at the level of what's different between the Christian revelation that we see in the New Testament and any other supposed documents. And we get to do that.
Fun.
On the next episode.
Thanks for joining us for A Time to Think.